Start Hour 6. 4. Congress should amend the Homeland Security Act and portions of the TTS of PROJECT to move detention of alien children expressly from the Department of Health and Human Services to DHS. Asylum Reform 1. The standard for a credible fear of persecution should be raised and aligned to the standard for asylum. It should also account specifically for credibility determinations that are a key element of the asylum claim. 2. Codify former asylum bars and third country transit rules. 3. Congress should eliminate the particular social group protected ground as vague and overbroad or, in the alternative, provide a clear definition with parameters that at a minimum codify the holding in matter of that gang violence and domestic violence are not grounds for asylum. Parole reform. Congress should end the widespread abuse of parole in contravention of statute and return it to its origins as an extraordinary remedy for very limited purposes. NGOs and processing. Congress should halt funds given to non-governmental organizations, NGOs, to process and transport illegal aliens into and throughout the United States. Such funds and infrastructure, including the DHS Joint Processing Centers, should be redirected to secure the border, detain aliens, and provide space for immigration court proceedings. Other pathways for border crossers. While Congress should use its oversight authority to ensure that expedited removal is used to the fullest extent and followed to the letter of the law, other paths for border crossers should be included in a legislative package. 1. Migrant protection protocols. Update the statutory language providing the basis for the Remain in Mexico program as needed to withstand judicial scrutiny and executive inaction. 2. Asylum cooperative agreements. While the agreements themselves must be negotiated, Congress should mandate that the executive branch work faithfully to negotiate and execute ACAs and set parameters to ensure that an unwilling executive cannot renege on an existing agreement or abandon the effort. 3. Other expedited pathways. Congress should explicitly permit programs akin to the Prompt Asylum Claim Review, PCR, and Humanitarian Asylum Review Process, HARP, programs. Employment Authorization 1. The Prompt Asylum Claim Review, PCR, and Humanitarian Asylum Review Process, HARP, programs. Employment Authorization 1. Congress should reassert control of employment authorization, which is subject to rampant regulatory abuse, and limit it to certain categories of legal immigrants and non-immigrants. 2. Congress should also permanently authorize E-Verify and make it mandatory. State and local law enforcement 1. Congress should unequivocally authorize state and local law enforcement to participate in immigration and border security actions in compliance with Arizona versus United States. 11.2. Congress should require compliance with immigration detainers to the maximum extent consistent with the 10th Amendment and set financial disincentives for jurisdictions that implement either official or unofficial sanctuary policies. Prosecutorial discretion. Congress should restrict the authority for prosecutorial discretion to eliminate it as a catch-all excuse for limiting immigration enforcement. Mandatory detention. Congress should eliminate ambiguous discretionary language in Title VIII that aliens may be detained and clarify that aliens shall be detained. This language, which contrasts with other shall detain language in statute, creates unhelpful ambiguity and allows the executive branch to ignore the will of Congress. Regulations. Withdraw Biden administration regulations and reissue new regulations in the following areas. 1. Credible fear/asylum jurisdiction for border crossers. 2. Public charge. T-visa and U-visa reform. Unless and until T and U visas are repealed, each program needs to be reformed to ensure that only legitimate victims of trafficking and crimes who are actively providing significant material assistance to law enforcement are eligible for spots in the queue. Repeal TPS designations. H-1B reform. Transform the program into an elite mechanism exclusively to bring in the best and brightest at the highest wages while simultaneously ensuring that U.S. workers are not being disadvantaged by the program. U.S. economy and to keep companies competitive, not to depress U.S. labor markets artificially in certain industries. Employment authorization. Along with the legislative proposal, take regulatory action to limit the classes of aliens eligible for work authorization. Executive orders. Pathways for border crossers 1. Direct the Department of State and the Department of Homeland Security to reinstate asylum cooperative agreements with Northern Triangle countries immediately. 2. Recommence negotiations with Mexico to fully implement the Remain in Mexico protocols. 3. Reinstate, to the extent possible, expedited pathways with full credible fear/immigration court process, PCR and HARP. 4. Prohibit the use of notices to report, the use of any funds for travel into the interior of the United States, and government flights or transportation for aliens. 5. Mandate that ICE use all detention space in full compliance with Section 235 of the INA, issue weekly reports on detention capacity, and provide authority for low-level temporary capacity, for example, tents, once permanent space is full. 6. Eliminate the use of ATD for border crossers except in rare cases and only with the explicit authority of the Secretary. 7. Prohibit the use of parole except in matters that are certified by the Secretary of Homeland Security as requiring action for humanitarian or significant public benefit reasons, and prohibit the use of parole in any categorical circumstance. Enforcement 1. Restrict prosecutorial discretion to eliminate it as a catch-all excuse for limiting immigration enforcement. 2. Mandate the use of E-Verify for anyone doing business with the government. 3. Designate USCIS as intelligence community adjacent, ensuring that it has access to national security and law enforcement databases. 4. Rescind all memoranda limiting enforcement of immigration laws, including those identifying sensitive zones. 5. End ICE's widespread use of termination and administrative closure of cases in immigration court. Averting or curtailing a mass migration event. 1. Secretary of Homeland Security determines that an actual or anticipated mass migration of aliens en route to or arriving off the coast of the U.S. presents urgent circumstances requiring an immediate federal response, the Secretary may make, subject to the approval of the President, rules and regulations prohibiting in whole or in part the introduction of persons from such countries or places as he or she shall designate in order to avert or curtail such mass migration and for such period of time as is deemed necessary, including through the expulsion of such aliens. Such rule and regulation making shall not be subject to the requirements of the Administrative Procedures Act. 2. Provide that notwithstanding any other provision of law, when the Secretary makes such a determination and then promulgates, subject to the approval of the President, such rules and regulations, the Secretary shall have the authority to waive all legal requirements of Title VIII that the Secretary, in his or her sole discretion, determines are necessary to avert or curtail the mass migration. Sub-regulatory matters, USCIS priorities/structural changes. 1. Ensure that focus is returned to vetting, base eligibility of applicants, and fraud detection. 2. Realign the Fraud Detection and National Security Directorate, FD&S, to ensure agency-wide consistency on implementation of fraud detection and vetting policies. 3. Review and repeal any internal agency memo that is inconsistent with the priorities described in this chapter. 287. G. Program. Issue a memo prohibiting any jurisdiction that applies from being denied access to the program unless good cause is shown. Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, priorities. Issue Department Management Directive and IC Companion Directive to refocus HSI on immigration offenses and criminal offenses typically associated with immigration, for example, human trafficking. All criminal investigative work without a clear nexus to the border or otherwise to Title VIII should be turned over to the appropriate federal agency. Blackie's warrants. ISOPLA, ERO, and HSI should issue a joint internal memo on operationalizing Blackie's warrants for immediate use on worksite enforcement and other appropriate investigations and operations. Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Needed reforms. FEMA is the lead federal agency in preparing for and responding to disasters, but it is overtasked, overcompensates for the lack of state and local preparedness and response, and is regularly in deep debt. After passage of the 1988 Stafford Act, 12, the number of declared federal disasters rose dramatically as most disaster costs were shifted from states and local governments to the federal government. In addition, state-friendly FEMA regulations, such as a per capita indicator, failed to maintain the pace of inflation and made it easy to meet disaster declaration thresholds. This combination has left FEMA unprepared in both readiness and funding for the truly catastrophic disasters in which its services are most needed. Reform of FEMA requires a greater emphasis on federalism and state and local preparedness, leaving FEMA to focus on large, widespread disasters. Under the Stafford Act, FEMA has the authority to adjust the per capita indicator for damages, which creates a threshold under which states and localities are not eligible for public assistance. FEMA should raise the threshold because the per capita indicator has not kept pace with inflation, and this over time has effectively lowered the threshold for public assistance and caused FEMA's resources to be stretched perilously thin. Alternatively, applying a deductible could accomplish a similar outcome while also incentivizing states to take a more proactive role in their own preparedness and response capabilities. In addition, Congress should change the cost share arrangement so that the federal government covers 25% of the costs for small disasters, with the cost share reaching a maximum of 75% for truly catastrophic disasters. FEMA is also responsible for the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, nearly all of which is issued by the federal government. Washington provides insurance at prices lower than the actuarially fair rate, thereby subsidizing flood insurance. Then, when flood costs exceed NFIP's revenue, FEMA seeks taxpayer-funded bailouts. Current NFIP debt is $20.5 billion, and in 2017, Congress canceled $16 billion in debt when FEMA reached its borrowing authority limit. These subsidies and bailouts only encourage more development in flood zones, increasing the potential losses to both NFIP and the taxpayer. The NFIP should be wound down and replaced with private insurance, starting with the least risky areas currently identified by the program. Budget issues. FEMA manages all grants for DHS, and these grants have become pork for states, localities, and special interest groups. Since 2002, DHS/FEMA have provided more than $56 billion in preparedness grants for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. For FY 2023, President Biden requested more than $3.5 billion for federal assistance grants. Funds provided under these programs do not provide measurable gains for preparedness or resiliency. Rather, more than any objective needs, political interests appear to direct the flow of non-disaster funds. The principles of federalism should be upheld. These indicate that states better understand their unique needs and should bear the costs of their particularized programs. FEMA employees in Washington, D.C. should not determine how billions of federal tax dollars should be awarded to train local law enforcement officers in Texas, harden cybersecurity infrastructure in Utah, or supplement migrant shelters in Arizona. DHS should not be in the business of handing out federal tax dollars. These grants should be terminated. Accomplishing this, however, will require action by members of Congress who repeatedly vote to fund grants for political reasons. The transition should focus on building resilience and return on investment in line with real threats. Personnel. FEMA currently has 4 Senate-confirmed positions. Only the administrator should be confirmed by the Senate. Other political leadership need not be confirmed by the Senate. Additionally, FEMA's springing cabinet position should be eliminated, as this creates significant unnecessary challenges to the functioning of the whole of DHS at points in time when coordinated responses are most needed. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. Needed reforms. CISA is supposed to have 2 key roles. 1. Protection of the federal civilian government networks, Gov, while coordinating the execution of national cyber defense and sharing information with non-federal and private sector partners, and 2. National coordination of critical infrastructure security and resilience. Yet CISA has rapidly expanded its scope into lanes where it does not belong, the most recent and most glaring example being censorship of so-called misinformation and disinformation. CISA's funding and resources should align narrowly with the foregoing 2 mission requirements. The component's Emergency Communications and Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards (CFATS) roles should be moved to FEMA, its school security functions should be transferred to state homeland security offices, and CISA should refrain from duplicating cybersecurity functions done elsewhere at the Department of Defense, FBI, National Security Agency, and U.S. Secret Service. Of the utmost urgency is immediately ending CISA's countermis/disinformation efforts. The federal government cannot be the arbiter of truth. CISA began this work because of alleged Russian misinformation in the 2016 election, which in fact turned out to be a Clinton campaign dirty trick. The intelligence community, including the NSA or DoD, should counter foreign actors. At the time of this writing, release of the Twitter files has demonstrated that CISA has devolved into an unconstitutional censoring and election engineering apparatus of the political left. In any event, the entirety of the CISA Cybersecurity Advisory Committee should be dismissed on day 1. For election security, CISA should help states and localities assess whether they have good cyber hygiene in their hardware and software in preparation for an election, but nothing more. This is of value to smaller localities, particularly by flagging who is attacking their websites. CISA should not be significantly involved closer to an election, nor should it participate in messaging or propaganda. U.S. Coast Guard, USCG. Needed reforms. The U.S. Coast Guard fleet should be sized to the needs of great power competition, specifically focusing efforts and investment on protecting U.S. waters, all while seeking to find, where feasible, more economical ways to perform USCG missions. The scope of the Coast Guard's mission needs to be focused on protecting U.S. resources and interests in its home waters, specifically its exclusive economic zone, 200 miles from shore. USCG's budget should address the growing demand for it to address the increasing threat from the Chinese fishing fleet in home waters as well as narcotics and migrant flows in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. Doing this will require reversing years of shortfalls in shipbuilding, maintenance, and upgrades of shore facilities as well as seeking more cost-effective ship and facility designs. In wartime, the USCG supports the Navy, but it has limited capability and capacity to support wartime missions outside home waters. New policies. The Coast Guard's mission set should be scaled down to match congressional budgeting in the long term, with any increased funding going to acquisitions based on an updated fleet mix analysis. The current shipbuilding plan is insufficient based on USCG analysis, and the necessary numbers of planned offshore patrol cutters and national security cutters are not supported by congressional budgets. The Coast Guard should be required to submit to Congress a long-range shipbuilding plan modeled on the Navy's 30-year shipbuilding plan. Ideally, this should become part of the Navy plan in a new comprehensive naval long-range shipbuilding plan to ensure better coherency in the service's requirements. Outside of home waters and following the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, the Coast Guard should prioritize limited resources to the nation's expansive Pacific waters to counter growing Chinese influence and encroachment. Expansion of facilities in American Samoa and basing of cutters. There is one clear step in this direction and should be accelerated, looking to free association states, Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands for enhanced and persistent presence, assuming adequate congressional funding, is another such step. The Secretary of the Navy should convene a naval board to review and reset requirements for Coast Guard wartime mission support. To inform and validate these updated requirements, the Chief of Naval Operations and the Coast Guard Commandant should execute dedicated annual joint wartime drills focused on USCG's wartime missions in the Pacific. The money for these activities should be allocated from DoD. An interagency maritime coordination office focused on developing and overseeing comprehensive efforts to advance the nation's maritime interests and increase its military and commercial competitiveness should be established. Given the USCG's history of underfunded missions, if the Coast Guard is to continue to maintain the Arctic mission, money to do so adequately will be required over and above current funding levels. Consideration should be given to shifting the Arctic mission to the Navy. Either way, the Arctic mission should be closely coordinated with our Canadian, Danish, and other allies. Personnel USCG is facing recruitment challenges similar to those faced by the military services. The administration should stop the messaging on wokeness and diversity and focus instead on attracting the best talent for USCG. Simultaneously, consistent with the Department of Defense, USCG should also make a serious effort to revet any promotions and hiring that occurred on the Biden administration's watch while also re-onboarding any USCG personnel who were dismissed from service for refusing to take the COVID-19 vaccine with time in service credited to such returnees. These two steps could be foundational for any improvements in the recruiting process. U.S. Secret Service, USSS. Needed reforms. The U.S. Secret Service must be the world's best protective agency. Currently, the agency is distracted by its dual mission of protection and financial investigations. The result has been a long series of high-profile embarrassments and security failures, perhaps most notably its allowing of then-Vice President-elect Kamala Harris to be inside the Democratic National Committee office on January 6, 2021, while a pipe bomb was outside. Despite the great size and scope of the January 6 investigation, this high-profile incident of danger to a protectee remains unresolved. The failures of the USSS protective mission are too numerous to list here. A December 2015 bipartisan report from the House Oversight Committee listed dozens of such incidents as well as needed recommendations for reform. This chapter adopts those findings and recommendations in whole, especially the finding that USSS's dual mission structure detracts from the agency's protective capabilities. At the time of that report, USSS agents spent only one-third of their work hours on protection-related activities as opposed to investigative activities. USSS was established initially to investigate counterfeit currency, but its mission has evolved over the decades to prioritize electronic financial crimes. For example, as this chapter was being written, all 15 of the USSS's most wanted individuals were wanted for financial crimes, many of them international in nature. Notably, the last head of the agency left not for a protection-related job, but to be the chief security officer of social media company Snapchat. This is a pattern that has developed over the years, with agents seeking to burnish their online financial crimes credentials to secure corporate security jobs. Coupled with some of the lowest morale in the federal government, the agency has completely lost sight of the primacy of its protective mission. New policies USSS should transfer to the Department of Justice and Department of the Treasury all investigations that are not related to its protective function. It should begin the logistical operation of closing all field offices throughout the country and internationally to the extent they are not taken over by Treasury or Justice. USSS agents stationed outside of Washington, D.C. should be transferred to work in immigration and customs enforcement field offices where they would continue to be the boots on the ground, to follow up on threat reports throughout the country and liaise with local law enforcement for visits by protectees. The only investigations not related to USSS's protective function that agents should pursue would be directed by HSI and relate to tracking the financial crimes associated with illegal immigration. This should include tracing remittances, any funds that are used to pay coyotes or the cartels, and payments by businesses to illegal aliens, and all other crimes associated with illegal immigration. USSS should keep visitor logs for all facilities where the president works or resides. The Biden administration has evaded such transparency, with President Biden spending a historic amount of time for a president at his Delaware residence. This has left the American people in the dark as to who is influencing the highest levels of their own government. The suggested reforms would result in a significant USSS budget reduction, primarily because the agency would relinquish dozens of physical offices throughout the U.S. and internationally. Some amount of savings should be used to fix the personnel problems and for recruitment initiatives aimed at individuals who are inclined to join a protection-focused agency. Personnel, as documented extensively in the above-referenced 2015 bipartisan congressional report, low morale and high turnover are key drivers of USSS problems. With their mission focused on protection, agents would no longer spend the bulk of their time developing unrelated skill sets. Instead, USSS agents could hone their protection skills and pursue a protection career path in the agency rather than quickly leaving USSS for high-paying corporate security jobs. The Uniform Division (UD) of USSS requires a significant staffing increase. As documented in the bipartisan report, understaffing results in unpredictable and long hours, which in turn result in high turnover, which only compounds the problem. Another key issue is that UD officers lack the ability to enforce criminal laws outside the immediate vicinity of the White House. As the District of Columbia is a federal jurisdiction and currently is beholden to the trend of progressive pro-crime policies, UD officers should enforce all applicable laws. The result would be to allow UD officers to gain more law enforcement experience, an attractive credential that would improve morale. Transportation Security Administration, TSA. The TSA model is costly and unwisely makes TSA both the regulator and the regulated organization responsible for screening operations. As part of an effort to shrink federal bureaucracies and bring private sector know-how to government programs, TSA is ripe for reform. The U.S. should look to the Canadian and European private models of providing aviation screening manpower to lower TSA costs while maintaining security. Until it is privatized, TSA should be treated as a national security provider, and its workforce should be deunionized immediately. TSA could privatize the screening function by expanding the current Screening Partnership Program, SPP, to all airports. TSA would turn screening operations over to airports that would choose security contractors that meet TSA regulations and would oversee and test airports for compliance. Alternatively, it could adopt a Canadian-style system, turning over screening operations to a new government corporation that contracts screening service to private contractors. Contractors would bid to provide their services to a set of airports in a particular region, likely with around 10 regions nationally. TSA would continue to set security regulations and test airports for compliance, and the new corporation would establish any operating procedures or customer service standards. With either model, the intelligence function for domestic travel patterns should remain with the U.S. government. The federal government could expect to save 15%, 20% from the existing aviation screening budget, but savings could be significantly larger. Service to travelers should also improve. Management Directorate, Management. The Management Directorate is unnecessarily large because each individual component also maintains its own respective management office. Too much overlap and red tape exists between headquarters, HQ, and components with regard to such functions as hiring, information technology, and procurement. Finance is unique given that HQ needs to address reprogramming and component budgets need to roll up into all department budgets. The Directorate requires intense reform, the specifics of which should be further assessed given its expansive nature. Front Office, FO. Immediately place a small team of advisors with a deep understanding of operational management, but who have some experience in government because they will need to understand the nuance of reduction in force, RF, appropriations hurdles when dealing with U.S. government reorganization, etc., to sit in the MGMTFO, reporting to the Secretary, ultimately either S1 or S2. One of these advisors should understand U.S. government employment law and be prepared to relocate personnel and downsize offices accordingly. This includes reverting to the original understanding of the function of individuals appointed to the senior executive service, competent managers who can work capably with any subject matter and in any location. Over the first few months of the administration, the advisor's role should be to assess what structural and procedural changes are appropriate. They should dissect the current standing management directives and the approval processes in place to implement and/or change them, Office of the Chief Human Capital Officer's processes and procedures, hurdles to the Office of Chief Procurement Officer's procurement of innovative technology, and the facilities plan, including the consolidation into the St. Elizabeth's campus. They should also be prepared to help implement any end to unionization of DHS components in response to an executive order pursuant to 5 U.S.C. 7103. Office of the Chief Financial Officer, OCFO. DHS responsibilities to work with Congress have been split between the Office of Legislative Affairs, OLE, and OCFO. OLE deals with the authorizing committees on policy issues, and OCFO works with the appropriations committees on budget planning, execution, and reprogramming. This split creates communication and visibility issues within DHS and inconsistency in answers to Congress. This is an issue not only within the HQ model, but also throughout the components. Either appropriations personnel should be moved to OLA, and there should be a dotted line, reporting structure to OCFO, or a policy that OLA personnel must be included on communications to Congress should be implemented. To avoid answer shopping by congressional staff, particularly appropriations staff, all budget communications from the OCFO, including from the CFO him/herself, should first be provided to the Director of OLA to ensure consistency of information, messaging, and answers. This may be deemed awkward given that the OCFO is a Senate-confirmed position, but it is necessary to avoid inaccuracies and inconsistencies in messaging. Federal Protective Service, FPS. FPS needs federal agents to develop, share, and receive operational information and maintain direct contact with the Secretary in the midst of heightened threats. Before the summer 2020 civil unrest, positioning FPS under MGMT was justified, but given the current climate, they should not be reporting through MGMT. This may be especially problematic if a management directorate under secretary lacking law enforcement or military experience is in place when a situation like summer 2020 arises. FPS should report to the secretary as other components, e.g., FLEC, do. This would add little to the Secretary's current burden unless or until civil unrest arises, at which point reporting to the Secretary creates a direct line between the primary DHS decision-maker, S1 or S2, and the FPS Director. Regarding operational communication, there should be information sharing mandates, MAs, which are applicable under specific circumstances where federal facilities are involved, between FPS and the U.S. Marshals, U.S. Park Police, and FBI. Agreements with U.S. Capitol Police and Supreme Court Police should also be considered, but it is noteworthy that those entities are jurisdictionally outside of the executive branch. Office of Strategy, Policy, and Plans, PLSY. Department-level reforms. PLSY should perform a complete inventory, analysis, and reevaluation of the department's domestic terrorism lines of effort to ensure that they are consistent with the President's priorities, congressional authorization, and Americans' constitutional rights. PLSY should likewise do a complete inventory, analysis, and evaluation of any of the department's work in coordination with social media outlets to censor or otherwise change or affect American speech. PLSY should comprehensively report on and publish this history in full so that the American people can know the facts. The department should remove all personnel who participated in any of this activity. The department has significant authority and budget to provide grants for various purposes. This effort is diffused across components and lacks central policy thought and coordination. PLSY should set a department-wide policy that establishes how granting choices are to be made and is consistent with the President's priorities. PLSY should clear all granting decisions to ensure that they are consistent with the new policy. PLSY-wide reforms. PLSY should work with Congress to streamline the department's reporting requirements. Because there has not been a departmental reauthorization bill and these requirements have been added piecemeal over 2 decades, they significantly overlap and even conflict, wasting resources and distracting from the department's mission. PLSY should seek the elimination of the quadrennial Homeland Security Review. Issue area reforms. PLSY should bolster its immigration statistics program and make it the one-stop shop for the timely production of all department immigration statistics and analysis. Office of Intelligence and Analysis, INA. The Office of Intelligence and Analysis should be eliminated both because it has not added value and because it has been weaponized for domestic political purposes. The intelligence community, IC, already provides raw intelligence to DHS components. In addition, the FBI, National Counterterrorism Center, and other agencies where necessary already provide holistic threat assessment products to federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments as well as to private sector entities at both the classified and unclassified levels where appropriate. I&A's work as an interlocutor between the IC and DHS components' individual intelligence operations on the one hand and government and the private sector on the other, as well as between the IC and the components, is at best duplicative. At worst, it is used and discussed in the media as a political tool, resulting in more harm than good to the U.S. government and IC writ large. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is not a member of the IC, should create cyber intelligence products in a collaborative fashion with the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command. Such efforts would lead to timelier usable classified and unclassified products for stakeholders that exceed the quality and capability of I&A's efforts. This same principle applies to other components as well. CBP, TSA, etc. all have their own intelligence operations and are better situated with their subject matter experts to make their own assessments. The National Operations Center, NOC, within the Office of Operations Coordination, OPS, should absorb those select INA functions and tactically proficient personnel that need to be maintained. For example, technical support to the National Vetting Center. The remainder of INA should be eliminated. The OPS entity should maintain IC status, and the only intelligence mission set should be to provide situational awareness and the dissemination of operational information or raw intelligence, no analysis or products, at classified and unclassified levels to executive leadership across the department, not outside of DHS. Office of the General Counsel, OGC. Needed reforms. OGC should advise principals as to how DHS can execute its missions within the law instead of advising principals as to why they cannot execute regulations, policies, and programs. Instead of each component's chief counsel reporting to the headquarters general counsel with a solid line, and indirectly to his or her component head with a dotted line, the accountability should be reversed. Due to the different missions throughout the department, the components can better manage the legal issues of their specific mission than headquarters can. Thus, the chief counsel, or equivalent, of each component should report directly to the component head, report indirectly to the DHS general counsel, and be accountable to the component head. The report to the general counsel is to ensure consistency of advice across DHS. OGC should hire significantly more Schedule C/political appointees who in turn supervise career staff and manage their output. DHS's mission is politically charged, and the legal function cannot be allowed to thwart the administration's agenda by providing stilted or erroneous legal positions and decision-making. OGC should serve as the center of the response to the legal challenges facing the department to ensure a streamlined, consistent response to a litany of issues facing the department. It is important to ensure consistency across all potential legal positions taken by the department, including those arising in litigation, congressional oversight, and inquiries received from the Inspector General, U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO, and Congressional Research Service, and pursuant to the Freedom of Information Act. OGC should invest in e-discovery software and contract with a vendor to manage the department's e-discovery. This would be beneficial both in litigation and in responding to congressional oversight. Removing delays in e-discovery processing would also reduce the issuance of subpoenas to the department and the generation of negative press for the administration that comes from delayed responses. The old practice of relying on executive secretary taskings to pull documents for congressional requests does not work. It is slow, the metrics for what documents are gathered and how are unclear, and the components do not gather responsive material in an efficient manner. Document gathering should come from the Office of the Chief Information Officer or a relevant technological element within the department that can pull responsive communications quickly. Office of Legislative Affairs, OLA, Office of Public Affairs, OPA, and Office of Partnership and Engagement, OP. DHS's external communications function should be consolidated and reformed so that the President's agenda can be implemented more effectively. The Office of Partnership and Engagement should be merged into the Office of Public Affairs. In many cabinet agencies, outreach to companies and partner organizations is similarly performed by the Office of Public Affairs. This would also accomplish a needed DHS organizational and management reform to decrease the number of direct reports to the Secretary. Both public and legislative affairs staff in the components should report directly to their respective headquarters equivalent. This would help to avoid a failure by the department to speak with one voice. It would also allow the component staff to perform more efficiently, overseen by expert managers in their trade. This would also allow DHS to respond to crises effectively by shifting staff as needed to the most pressing issues and better use underutilized staff at less active components. Only political appointees in OLA should interact directly with congressional staff on all inquiries, including budget and appropriations matters. To prevent congressional staff from answer shopping among HQ OLA, the DHS OCFO, and components, DHS Legislative Affairs Appropriations staff should be moved from MGMT OCFO into OLA. Regarding components, budget/appropriations staff should move from component budget offices into component legislative affairs offices. Because dozens of congressional committees and subcommittees either have or claim to have jurisdiction over some DHS function, DHS staff from the Secretary on down spend so much time responding to congressional hearing and briefing requests, letters, and questions for the record that they are left with little time to do their assigned job of protecting the homeland. The next president should reach an agreement with congressional leadership to limit committee jurisdiction to one authorizing committee and one appropriations committee in each chamber. If congressional leadership will not limit their committee's jurisdiction over DHS, DHS should identify one authorizing and appropriations committee in each chamber and answer only to it. To focus more precisely on the DHS mission, OLA staff should also identify outdated and needless congressional reporting requirements and notify Congress that DHS will cease reporting on such matters. For other congressional reports, OLA should implement a sunset date so that Congress must regularly demonstrate the need for specific data. In both OPA and OLA, a change in mission and culture is needed. The clients of both components are the President and the Secretary, not the media, external organizations, or Congress. OPA and OLA should change from being compliance correspondents for outside entities airing grievances to serving as messengers and advocates for the President and the Secretary. Office of Operations Coordination, OPS. OPS was originally conceived by then-Secretary Jed Johnson as an entity tasked with coordinating cross-DHS assets on an as-needed basis using a joint operations approach. This role is particularly challenging because of the disparate nature of mission sets across DHS. OPS should absorb a very small number of tactical intelligence professionals from INA as the rest of INA is shut down. Such intelligence officers would be a subordinate element within OPS placed within the National Operations Center. The intelligence officers would provide tactical intelligence support for upcoming or ongoing operations in addition to liaising with their agency/component counterparts. There would be no strategic intelligence analysis done as part of OPS or its new INA subelement. In addition to facilitating all of DHS coordination on a task-by-task basis, OPS would be responsible for ongoing situational awareness for the Secretary and Deputy Secretary. In addition to long-term staffing, OPS would have cycling billets from each of the major agencies and components to facilitate its most effective working relationships across DHS. Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, CRCL, and Privacy Office, PRIV. The Homeland Security Act established only an officer of CRCL, not an office. The only substantive function Congress then assigned to the officer was to review and assess information alleging abuses of civil rights. Since then, Congress and CRCL itself have significantly expanded CRCL's scope and size well beyond its original intent or helpful purpose. CRCL now operates and views itself as a quasi-DHS Office of Inspector General. This results in a considerable waste of limited component resources, which are routinely tasked to address redundant, overly burdensome, and uninformed demands from CRCL. It is therefore important to recalibrate CRCL's scope and reach. The organizational structure of both CRCL and the Privacy Office should be changed to ensure proper alignment with the department's mission. The Office of General Counsel should absorb both CRCL's and PRIV's necessary functions and staff. Although the CRCL officer and the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, officer/privacy officer are statutory, their offices are not mandatory. CRCL and PRIV officers and employees should report to a Deputy General Counsel, who would be a political appointee. The CRCL officer should focus on equal employment opportunity, EO, compliance, and the civil liberties function and investigate matters only within headquarters or support components. Operational components civil liberties officers should investigate incidents regarding their own agencies. The CRCL officer should ensure that all civil liberties or civil rights complaints are sent to the Office of Inspector General, OG, for review. If the OG chooses not to investigate, the CRCL officer should only provide supportive information on possible courses of action for complainants. The PRIV officer and FOIA officer should focus on FOIA, privacy compliance policy, and privacy incident response. The Deputy General Counsel should provide guidance to DHS leadership regarding privacy compliance and privacy incident response. To ensure that only U.S. persons and lawful permanent residents are provided protections as required by the Privacy Act, all DHS issuances should be updated to reflect that DHS protects the privacy of individuals as required by the Privacy Act, U.S. persons and lawful permanent residents, 16 the Judicial Redress Act of 2015, 17 and NEU.S, European Union Data Protection and Privacy Agreement. Because of the lack of public trust in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, CRCL and PRIV staff should no longer review intelligence products or provide guidance on any intelligence products or reports. A consistent, clear, and singular message is necessary for DHS's mission. Therefore, all communications and/or meetings with any federal, state, local, or non-government groups should be limited to the Deputy General Counsel. In addition, given the narrower scope of work, OGC should disband the outside advisory boards and the more than 50 working groups in which CRCL and PRIV currently participate. Finally, CRCL and PRIV should no longer issue bulletins or periodicals. Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsman, OIDO, and Office of the Citizenship and Immigration Services Ombudsman, CISOM, OIDO, the Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsman should be eliminated. This requires a statutory change in Section 106 of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2020. OIDO was designed to create another impediment to detention through an additional layer of so-called oversight. Several agencies already perform detention oversight. ICE conducts internal audits of facilities and investigates complaints against IC agents through the Office of Professional Responsibility. Similarly, CBP accepts individual complaints regarding facilities through the Joint Intake Center and manages complaints against agents through the OPR. In addition, CRCL, OIG, GAO, and Congress all perform detention oversight. These multiple bodies place unmanageable and unreasonable burdens on IC to manage several sometimes inconsistent audits/inspections at the same time. If OIDO remains a DHS component, the Secretary should immediately issue a directive stripping CRCL of its immigration portfolio. OIDO is in a better position with dedicated resources and immigration experts to perform this function than CRCL is. Allowing both offices to conduct detention oversight is duplicative and wasteful. The Secretary should conduct a thorough review of the effectiveness of Directive 0810.1/19, which is widely interpreted as requiring a wholesale referral of cases to OIG. In reality, OIG investigates only a small fraction of them and often sits on cases for longer than the 5-day window specified in the directive. Meanwhile, the other agencies wait in limbo to execute their duties. CISOM. The Office of the Citizenship and Immigration Services Ombudsman should be eliminated. The DHS bureaucracy is too large, and the Secretary has too many direct reports. CISOM's policy functions can be performed, and sometimes already are, by OG and GAO. The specialized casework can be moved into USCIS as a special unit, much like the IRS taxpayer advocate. This would require a statutory change to Section 452 of the Homeland Security Act of 2002. If CISOM continues as a DHS component, a policy should be issued that prohibits CISOM from assisting illegal aliens to obtain benefits. Currently, approximately 15%, 20% of CISOM's workload consists of helping DACA applicants obtain and renew benefits, including work authorization. This is not the role of an ombudsman. In addition, the government should be a neutral adjudicator, not an advocate for illegal aliens. Agency relationships. It is critical to the achievement of the President's policy objectives that all agencies and departments touching immigration policy work in sync with one another. While there are numerous areas in which such cooperation is critical, immigration has proven to be the most difficult. Accordingly, several objectives will be necessary for each of the following departments. Department of Health and Human Services, agree to move the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, to DHS, or, alternatively, implement an aggressive and regular effort by the Secretary of HHS to ensure that ORR is fully pursuing presidential objectives in support of DHS. Department of Defense, assist in aggressively building the border wall system on America's southern border. Additionally, explicitly acknowledge and adjust personnel and priorities to participate actively in the defense of America's borders, including using military personnel and hardware to prevent illegal crossings between ports of entry and channel all cross-border traffic to legal ports of entry. Department of Justice, agree to move the Executive Office for Immigration Review and the Office of Immigration Litigation to DHS and/or, alternatively, to treat the administrative law judges, immigration judges, and Board of Immigration Appeals as national security personnel, decertify their union, and move to increase hiring significantly to enable the processing of more immigration cases. Department of State, allow DHS to lead international engagement in the Western Hemisphere on issues of security and migration. Additionally, quickly and aggressively address recalcitrant countries' failure to accept deportees by imposing stiff sanctions until deportees are in fact accepted for return, not just promised to be taken. Department of Housing and Urban Development, ensure that only U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents utilize or occupy federally subsidized housing. Department of Education, deny loan access to those who are not U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents, and deny loan access to students at schools that provide in-state tuition to illegal aliens. Department of Labor, eliminate the 2 of 4 lowest wage levels for foreign workers. Department of the Treasury, implement all necessary regulations both to equalize taxes between American citizens and working visa holders and to provide DHS with all tax information of illegal aliens as expeditiously as possible. Intelligence community, cooperate in the shrinking or elimination of the INA role in the IC while replacing it with CBP and HSI representation to the IC. Page 171. Department of State. The U.S. Department of State's mission is to bilaterally, multilaterally, and regionally implement the President's foreign policy priorities, to serve U.S. citizens abroad, and to advance the economic, foreign policy, and national security interests of the United States. Since the U.S. founding, the Department of State has been the American government's designated tool of engagement with foreign governments and peoples throughout the world. Country names, borders, leaders, technology, and people have changed in the more than 2 centuries since the founding, but the basics of diplomacy remain the same. Although the department has also evolved throughout the years, at least in the modern era, there is one significant problem that the next president must address to be successful. There are scores of fine diplomats who serve the president's agenda, often helping to shape and interpret that agenda. At the same time, however, in all administrations, there is a tug-of-war between presidents and bureaucracies, and that resistance is much starker under conservative presidents, due largely to the fact that large swaths of the State Department's workforce are left-wing and predisposed to disagree with the conservative president's policy agenda and vision. It should not and cannot be this way. The American people need and deserve a diplomatic machine fully focused on the national interest as defined through the election of a president who sets the domestic and international agenda for the nation. The next administration must take swift and decisive steps to reforge the department into a lean and functional diplomatic machine that serves the president and, thereby, the American people. Below is the basic but essential roadmap for achieving these repairs. History and context. Founded in 1789, the Department of State was one of the first cabinet-level agencies in the new American government. The first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, oversaw a small staff, diplomatic posts in London and Paris, and 10 consular posts. Today, the Department of State has almost 80,000 total employees, including 13,517 Foreign Service employees and 11,683 Civil Service employees, in 275 embassies, consulates, and other posts around the world. In theory, the State Department is the principal agency responsible for carrying out the President's foreign policy and representing the United States in other nations and international organizations. To the extent consistent with presidential policy and federal law, the department also supports U.S. citizens and businesses in other nations and vets foreign nationals seeking temporary or permanent entrance to the United States. The State Department also provides humanitarian, security, and other assistance to non-U.S. populations in need, and otherwise advances and supports U.S. national interests abroad. Properly led, the State Department can be instrumental for communicating and implementing a foreign policy vision that best serves American citizens. As the U.S. Commission on National Security/21st Century, the Hart-Rudman Commission, observed more than 20 years ago, the State Department is a crippled institution, suffering from an ineffective organizational structure in which regional and functional policies do not serve integrated goals, and in which sound management, accountability, and leadership are lacking. Unfortunately, this critique remains accurate. The State Department's failures are not due to a lack of resources. As one expert has observed, the department has significantly more at its disposal than was the case at the end of the Cold War, in the mid-1990s, and at the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. A major source, if not the major source, of the State Department's ineffectiveness lies in its institutional belief that it is an independent institution that knows what is best for the United States, sets its own foreign policy, and does not need direction from an elected president. The next president can make the State Department more effective by providing a clear foreign policy vision, selecting political officials and career diplomats that will enthusiastically turn that vision into a policy agenda, and firmly supporting the State Department as it makes the necessary institutional adjustments. Political leadership and bureaucratic leadership and support. Focusing the State Department on the needs and goals of the next president will require the president's hand-picked political leadership, as well as foreign service and civil service personnel who share the president's vision and policy agendas to run the department. This can be done by taking these steps at the outset of the next administration. Exert leverage during the confirmation process. Notwithstanding the challenges and slowness of the modern U.S. Senate confirmation process, the next president can exert leverage on the Senate if he or she is willing to place State Department appointees directly into those roles, pending confirmation. Doing so would both ensure that the department has immediate senior political leadership and would force the Senate to act on nominees' appointments instead of being allowed to engage in dilatory tactics that cripple the State Department's functionality for weeks, months, or even years. Assert leadership in the appointment process. The next administration should assert leadership over and guidance to the State Department by placing political appointees in positions that do not require Senate confirmation, including senior advisors, principal deputy assistant secretaries, and deputy assistant secretaries. Given the department's size, the next administration should also increase the number of political appointees to manage it. To the extent possible, all non-confirmed senior appointees should be selected by the President-elect's transition team or the new President's Office of Presidential Personnel, depending on the timing of selection, and be in place the first day of the administration. No one in a leadership position on the morning of January 20th should hold that position at the end of the day. These recommendations do not imply that foreign service and civil service officials should be excluded from key roles. It is hard to imagine a scenario in which they are not immediately relevant to the transition of power. The main suggestion here is that as many political appointees as possible should be in place at the start of a new administration. Support and train political appointees. The Secretary of State should use his or her office and its resources to ensure regular coordination among all political appointees, which should take the form of strategy meetings, trainings, and other events. The Secretary should also take reasonable steps to ensure that the State Department's political appointees are connected to other departments' political appointees, which is critical for cross-agency effectiveness and morale. The Secretary should capitalize on the more experienced political appointees by using them as the foundation for a mentorship program for less experienced political appointees. The interaction of political appointees must be routine and operational rather than incidental or occasional, and it must be treated as a crucial dimension for the next administration's success. Maximize the value of career officials. Career foreign service and civil service personnel can and must be leveraged for their expertise and commitment to the President's mission. Indeed, the State Department has thousands of employees with unparalleled linguistic, cultural, policy, and administrative skills, and large numbers of them have been an enormous resource to the Secretaries of State under which they have served. The Secretary must find a way to make clear to career officials that despite prior history and modes of operation, they need not be adversaries of a conservative president, Secretary of State, or the team of political appointees. Reboot ambassadors worldwide. All ambassadors are required to submit letters of resignation at the start of a new administration. Previous Republican administrations have accepted the resignations of only the political ambassadors and allowed the foreign service ambassadors to retain their posts, sometimes for months or years into a new administration. The next administration must go further. It should both accept the resignations of all political ambassadors and quickly review and reassess all career ambassadors. This review should commence well before the new administration's first day. Ambassadors in countries where U.S. policy or posture would substantially change under the new administration, as well as any who have evinced hostility toward the incoming administration or its agenda, should be recalled immediately. The priority should be to put in place new ambassadors who support the President's agenda among political appointees, foreign service officers, and civil service personnel, with no predetermined percentage among these categories. Political ambassadors with strong personal relationships with the President should be prioritized for key strategic posts such as Australia, Japan, the United Kingdom, the United Nations, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Righting the ship. Ensuring the State Department is accountable for serving American citizens first will require, at a minimum, that the following steps be implemented immediately. Review retroactively. Before inauguration, the President-elect's department transition team should assess every aspect of State Department negotiations and funding commitments. Upon inauguration, the Secretary of State should order an immediate freeze on all efforts to implement unratified treaties and international agreements, allocation of resources, foreign assistance disbursements, domestic and international contracts and payments, hiring and recruiting decisions, etc., pending a political appointee-driven review to ensure that such efforts comport with the new administration's policies. The quality of this review is more important than speed. The posture of the department during this review should be an unwavering desire to prioritize the American people, including a recognition that the federal government must be a diligent steward of taxpayer dollars. Implement repair. The State Department must change its handling of international agreements to restore constitutional governance. Under prior administrations, unnecessary institutional factors in the department caused numerous logistical challenges in negotiating, approving, and implementing treaties and agreements. This is particularly true under the Biden administration. For example, under the Biden administration, the State Department was considered sufficiently unreliable in terms of alignment and effectiveness such that its political leadership invoked its Circular 175, C. 175, authority to delegate its diplomatic capacity to other agencies, such as the Department of Homeland Security. At time of publication, the State Department is negotiating, or seeking to negotiate, large-scale, sovereignty-eroding agreements that could come at considerable economic and other costs to the American people. Although such agreements should be evaluated and approved as our treaties, the Biden administration is likely to simply call them agreements. The Biden State Department not only approves, but also enforces treaties that have not been ratified by the U.S. Senate. EDs. The Biden administration is likely to simply call them agreements. The Biden State Department not only approves, but also enforces treaties that have not been ratified by the U.S. Senate. This practice must be thoroughly reviewed and most likely jettisoned. The next president should recalibrate how the State Department handles treaties and agreements, primarily by restoring constitutionality to these processes. He or she should direct the Secretary of State to freeze any ongoing treaty or international agreement negotiations and assess whether those efforts align with the new president's foreign policy direction. The next administration should also direct the Secretary to order an immediate stand-down on enforcement of any treaties that have not been ratified by the Senate, and order a thorough review of the degree to which such enforcement has impacted the department's functions, policies, and use of resources. The Secretary of State, in cooperation with the Office of the Attorney General and the White House Counsel's Office, should also conduct a review to identify agreements that are really treaty commitments within the ordinary public meaning of the Constitution, 6, and suspend compliance pending presidential transmittal of those agreements to the Senate for advice and consent. The next administration should also move to withdraw from treaties that have been under Senate consideration for 20 years or more, with the understanding that those treaties are unlikely to be ratified. Under circumstances in which ratification of a stale treaty before the Senate still serves national interests, the treaty letter of transmittal and submission should be updated for current circumstances. The Secretary of State must revoke most outstanding C-175 authorities that have been granted to other agencies during previous administrations, although such revocations should be closely coordinated with the White House for logistical reasons. Coordinate with other agencies. Interagency engagement in this new environment must be similarly adjusted to mirror presidential direction. Indeed, coordination among federal agencies is challenging even in the most well-oiled administrations. Although such coordination is inescapable and sometimes productive, agencies tend to leverage each other's resources in ways that occasionally have off-mission consequences for the agency or agencies with the resources. Ideally, the Secretary of State should work as part of an agile foreign policy team along with the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, and other agency heads to flesh out and advance the president's foreign policy. Bureaucratic stovepipes of the past should be less important than commitment to, and achievement of, the president's foreign policy agenda. The State Department's role in these interagency discussions must reflect the president's clear direction and disallow resources and tools to be used in any way that detracts from the presidentially directed mission. Coordinate with Congress. Congress has both the statutory and appropriations authority to impact the State Department's operations and has a strong interest in key aspects of American foreign policy. The department must therefore take particular care in its interaction with Congress, since poor interactions with Congress, regardless of intentions, could trigger congressional pushback or have other negative impacts on the president's agenda. This will require particularly strong leadership of the Department of State's Bureau of Legislative Affairs. The Secretary of State and political leadership should ensure full coordination with the White House regarding congressional engagement on any State Department responsibility. This may lead to, for example, the President authorizing the State Department to engage with members of Congress and relevant committees on certain issues, including statutorily designated congressional consultations, but to remain radio silent on volatile or designated issues on which the White House wants to be the primary or only voice. All such authorized department engagements with Congress must be driven and handled by political appointees in conjunction with career officials who have the relevant expertise and are willing to work in concert with the President's political appointees on particularly sensitive matters. Respond vigorously to the Chinese threat. The State Department recently opened the Office of China Coordination, or China House. This office is intended to bring together experts inside and outside the State Department to coordinate U.S. government relations with China and advance our vision for an open, inclusive international system. Whether China House will streamline U.S. government communication, consensus, and action on China policy, given the presence of other agencies with strong competing or adverse interests, remains to be seen. The unit is dependent on adequate and competent staff being assigned by other bureaus within the State Department. Nonetheless, the concept is one a Republican administration should support mutatis mutandis. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has been at war with the U.S. for decades. Now that this reality has been accepted throughout the government, the State Department must be prepared to lead the U.S. diplomatic effort accordingly. The centralization of efforts in one place is critical to this end. Review immigration and domestic security requirements. Arguably, the department's most noteworthy challenge on the global stage has been its handling of immigration and domestic security issues, which are inextricably related. The State Department's apparent posture toward these two issues, which are of paramount importance to the American people, has historically been that they are of lesser importance than other issues and that they can be treated as concessions in broader diplomatic engagements. In other instances in which access to the U.S. in the form of immigrant, permanent, and non-immigrant, temporary, visas could potentially serve as diplomatic leverage, it is almost never used. To some degree, the State Department and many of its personnel appear to view the U.S. immigration system less as a tool for strengthening the United States and more as a global welfare program. To ensure the safety, security, and prosperity of all Americans, this must change. Below are several key areas in which the department's formal and informal postures must adjust to reflect the current immigration and domestic security environment. Visa reciprocity. The United States should strictly enforce the doctrine of reciprocity when issuing visas to all foreign nationals. For too long, the U.S. has provided virtually unfettered access to foreign nationals from countries that do not respond in kind, including countries that are actively hostile to U.S. interests and nationals. Mandatory reciprocity will convey the necessary reality that other countries do not have an unfettered right to U.S. access and must reciprocally offer favorable visa-based access to U.S. nationals. The State Department's reaction time to other countries' changes in visa policies with respect to the U.S. must be streamlined to ensure it can be updated in real time. Section 243(d) Visa Sanctions. Visa sanctions under Section 243(d) of the Immigration and Nationality Act, INA 8, enacted into law to motivate countries to accept the return of any nationals who have been ordered removed from the U.S., should be quickly and fully enforced. Recalcitrant countries that do not accept receipt of their returned nationals will risk the suspension of issuance of all immigrant visas, all non-immigrant visas, or all visas. These country-specific sanctions should remain in place until the sanctioned country accepts the return of all its removal-pending nationals and formally commits to future, regular acceptance of its nationals. Black-letter implementation of this law will demonstrate a heretofore lacking seriousness to the international community that other nations must respect U.S. immigration laws and work with federal authorities to accept returning nationals, or lose access to the United States, right-sizing refugee admissions. The Biden administration has engineered what is nothing short of a collapse of U.S. border security and interior immigration enforcement. This administration's humanitarian crisis, which is arguably the greatest humanitarian crisis in the modern era, one which has harmed Americans and foreign nationals alike, will take many years and billions of dollars to fully address. One casualty of the Biden administration's behavior will be the current form of the U.S. Refugee Admission Program, USRAP. The federal government's obligation to shift national security, essential screening, and vetting resources to the forged border crisis will necessitate an indefinite curtailment of the number of USRAP refugee admissions. The State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, which administers USRAP, must shift its resources to challenges stemming from the current immigration situation until the crisis can be contained and refugee-focused screening and vetting capacity can reasonably be restored. Strengthening bilateral and multilateral immigration-focused agreements. Restoration of both domestic security and the integrity of the U.S. immigration system should start with rapid reactivation of several key initiatives in effect at the conclusion of the Trump administration. Reimplementation of the Remain in Mexico policy, safe third country agreements, and other measures to address the influx of non-Mexican asylum applicants at the United States-Mexico border must be day one priorities. Although the State Department must rein in the C-175 authorities of other agencies, the Department of Homeland Security should retain or regain C-175 authorities for negotiating bilateral and multilateral security agreements, evaluation of national security, vulnerable visa programs. To protect the American people, the State Department, in coordination with the White House and other security-focused agencies, should evaluate several key security-sensitive visa programs that it manages. Key programs include, but should not be limited to, the Diversity Visa Program, the F, Student, Visa Program, and J, Exchange Visitor, Visa Program. The State Department's evaluation must ensure that these programs are not only consistent with White House immigration policy, but also align with its national security obligations and resource limitations.